A special thank you to Kevin's Worldwide, one of America's leading promotional products company, for sponsoring this edition of the Business Builder Show. We are at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania, where we had the pleasure and honor of interviewing Professor Harbir Singh and Professor Michael Useem.
Entrepreneurs, small business owners, professionals who seek excellence, bringing the business classroom to you. It's the Business Builder Show. Here's Marty Wolf.
Welcome to the Business Builder Show. I'm your host, Marty Wolf. The Business Builder Show is for business owners, business leaders, and professionals who seek excellence. I am thrilled to be at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania to spend some time with Professor Harbir Singh and with Professor Michael Useem. They have teamed up to write a terrific book called The Strategic Leader's Roadmap, 6 Steps for Integrating Leadership and Strategy. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Gentlemen, welcome to the Business Builder Show.
Thank you, Marty. And just to say a word about ourselves before we get going, I'm Mike Useem, as Marty indicated. I'm on the faculty here at the Wharton School, part of the University of Pennsylvania. And my main focus is on working with people like yourselves on management, leadership, and also on governance. Our topic today, of course, though, is management and leadership. And in that connection, at the school here, we have some 5,000 students. We also work with about 9,000 people like yourselves, mid or sometimes senior career managers. And in that connection, I've often worked with my colleague, Harbir Singh, in coursework, programmatic work that seeks to provide some bridge between thinking strategically and then leading the consequences of a good strategic thought. Once you know where you're going, then you got to do it, and that's all about leadership. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Harbir Singh.
I'm Harbir Singh. I'm a professor at the Wharton School working on strategy and leadership. And in addition to what Mike was saying, what I will add is that my interests are about pursuing corporate growth, gaining competitive advantage, and also really embedding strategy into the firm and making sure that leadership is aligned in relation to the goals of the firm.
So you wrote this great book called The Strategic Leader's Roadmap. My first question is, why did you think this was needed? Why did you do this?
You know, Marty, Harbir and I had contact along the way, now a year or two back, with the chief executive for both Renault and Nissan, the great Japanese automaker. It's an amazing guy. Carlos Ghosn is his name. He runs Renault a couple weeks every month in Paris, and then he flies to Tokyo and runs a different company, Nissan, in Tokyo. And in sitting down with him, we were struck by the fact that as he was dispatched by Renault to work with Nissan, when Renault made a strategic investment in Nissan, which was struggling at the time, he fairly early concluded that Nissan actually had a strategy for a turnaround. It was struggling. It didn't have an SUV on the market. Sales were down. Factories were underutilized. Suppliers weren't providing all those components in a timely fashion. And he said there was actually a pretty good plan here, but somehow it had never been, let's call it, executed. It just hadn't, great ideas, but just hadn't happened.
Yes.
He arrived and he elaborated the plan. He developed what becomes called the Nissan Revival Plan. And what was vital in him that prior top management evidently did not have was an ability to get the strategy right and then actually make it happen. So with that, we began to reflect on the fact that in our school, and in fact in our own teaching, we often offer coursework that's on leadership, and then somewhat separately, we offer coursework on competitive strategy. And for people in the world, as opposed to people in an academic chair, you've really got to be able to do both. You've got to think strategically, you've really got to act decisively, and hence our topic.
Yes. So that became apparent then. There was obviously, apparently from reading the book, a pretty decent strategic plan before he arrived.
Right.
And then so things started to reveal themselves. So your reason's the same?
Well, I think certainly inspired by the Carlos Ghosn story. I think what's fascinating about that also is his diagnosis, because when he arrived, Nissan had just about 6 months of cash left, was about to go bankrupt. It had 144,000 employees and 12 factories. And what he did really was to diagnose the situation and reduce it to four things. And that's part of strategic leadership. It's you don't take 25 things, very big, very complicated, reduce it to four things. One was reduce the supply chain to half the number of suppliers, reduce the number of models by half, shut down 1/3 of the factories, and the fourth thing was actually innovate on new models. So three were kind of triage, cost cutting, but the fourth was innovation. And most people who offer strategic advice say you can't cost cut and innovate at the same time.
That's a very, very good point. Absolutely. That's what you
Yes.
hear all the time.
Exactly.
You hear that in the business world, you hear that in the academic world, quite frankly. You
Yes.
can't do them both.
Cannot do them both. And how he did that was really to translate the strategy into initiatives which were separable. So there was a group that was doing new product development, another group doing R&D, and other groups looking at supply chain and so on. And that way he was able to execute these strategies that were actually, in some ways, not directly compatible with each other.
Yeah.
But then he was able to turn around the company in 2 years.
Yeah, and you mentioned in another interview that I listened to and in the book the importance of execution, and
Yes.
we'll get to that. So I brought my book along. I kind of studied up a little bit, but that's part of it. But let's not get too far ahead because teaming was part of what he did. But let's not get too far ahead. So let's go even further on the whole idea in terms of a definition of strategic leadership and why is that? Why is this so critical for leaders and managers to learn more about? What makes it so critically important?
So I think as Mike and I actually teach a program on becoming strategic leaders, and that's offered actually in the Wharton School in Dubai, in India, and in China. So we actually taught for a couple of years, and this inspired the book because strategy is very abstract. If you think about, and you ask anybody what the strategy is, they'll get into something about vision and looking 25
Right.
years out and having a PowerPoint that explains the strategy. And leadership is very much, people oriented, inspirational.
Vision, aspiration, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So those are disconnected. So the main thing that we did in this book was to interweave strategy and leadership. That's what we've done here. And another example, actually, besides, just to continue the Carlos Ghosn story, he inspired a lot of the junior managers and gave them room to innovate. So strategy is also about layering and leadership, getting the middle management and the frontline managers to be inspired by the direction, but also realize what is the core agenda. And you can then innovate around the core agenda. So that's a very, very important point.
It sounds simple, doesn't
Yes,
it?
it
It
does
sounds simple.
Yes.
But so many companies struggle, I guess, because we have all been educated that they are separate. I
Yes.
guess that's why business people say, okay, this is in one room and this is in the other room, and the two shall not come together. So therefore, strategic leadership, and therefore a great book that's a leader's roadmap, and we're going to get into that. Give me an example. We've already talked about one, but how about another example of a manager who was doing a great job pursuing strategy, but maybe wasn't a great leader? Do you have any examples of maybe one of those that we could talk about?
Well, Marty, to pick a very contemporary example or two, Wells Fargo, much damaged by the revelations of the last few months about creating false accounts for several million customers, and letting the customers actually pay for the accounts that they had not created. Here was a company, America's biggest bank these days in terms of employment, and on some days the assets under management. And they had an aggressive strategy. We all have an aggressive strategy. The Wharton School's got a very strong strategy. That said, the art of leadership is to appreciate where a strategy is going to work, how you're going to work it, and how you're going to avoid going off a cliff while trying to make it happen.
Yes.
And it seems that that's exactly what happened there. Very strong, aggressive targets on creating more retail accounts. What bank doesn't want to do that?
And that's a great strategy.
It's a great
You want to
strategy.
grow your business. Right. You want to increase your profits. Great strategy.
And isn't leadership all about appreciating the human condition? And if you put the screws on people or put them between a vice, maybe that's a better metaphor, to get the job done for fear of losing their job their own job if they don't. No wonder we saw what happened. Several million accounts falsely created. And by the way, Wells Fargo paying dearly for that in terms of penalty. The chief executive was ousted.
Yes.
And so this is why that's why we wrote the book. We really are worried about people who become very good at strategy but don't add in the leadership piece, and vice versa. Think about the opposite. Great leadership without strategy means you can get things done, but you have no idea where you're going.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think there's, I don't know, I'll say plenty of them, but I think there's probably more who are on the leadership / visionary side who will lead the troops just about anywhere, but may not have where that anywhere is clear. So do we have some examples, or anybody you can think of, or a company you can think of that maybe had that great leadership but didn't have a strong strategy?
So if you look at Microsoft under Steve Ballmer, Microsoft had done very well. It was dominating. But when he came in, he was the most inspirational leader possible. In fact, you could see him,
loved them all, cheering,
sweating and cheering,
all that kind of,
and really getting everybody going. A wonderful sales leader. But then they missed the boat on the mobile platform.
Yeah.
And the reason was he kept emphasizing the desktop, which they were doing very well at. And it's really taken a new leader to redirect the company. So sometimes people don't have the mix, they're not able to, and no individual necessarily has the mix, but the team as a whole
good point
needs to have the mix.
We may jump around a little bit. Now, hopefully you're okay with that. I'm sure you're comfortable.
Please.
You literally wrote the book, so but that happens. Sometimes people just I'll call it at the top, don't listen to the lieutenants.
Yes.
And the frontline people, or the lieutenants, the supervisors, those kinds of folks, sometimes they're not paying attention for whatever reason. I'm not sure, what that is.
So, Marty, to pick up on that, and this kind of now gets into the roadmap. If we want to combine these two areas, we want them to be in the same person. For people to walk around with both a sense for what the competitive strategy is in their head, and then in the other half of their brain, be ready to actually make it happen, appreciate the limits of human nature, and not go off a cliff in doing that. And one of the A cases for us on that, which gets to one of the key points on the leader's roadmap, as we now seek to combine the two. We have 6 kind of way stations, so to speak, or stops.
Correct.
As you do build a relationship between strategy and leadership, we have the case we develop at some length in the book of a person named John Chambers, who had worked for a now a long gone firm called Wang Instruments.
Yes.
And Wang was one of those early sensations as the digital age arrived. It made a great desktop. A lot of people, including myself, had a copy. And it abruptly, literally overnight, went belly up. And John Chambers is thinking, whoa, I've seen what can happen if you've got strategy and leadership not fully put together.
Yeah.
There were strategic changes in the market. On Wang, who was the creator, the founder, his name is on the front door, was unable to appreciate some of the profound changes that were sweeping through digital computing at the time. And with an enormous workforce and a big brand, it literally dropped off the face of the earth just one day. John Chambers, since then, as he then went on to work and build for 20 years Cisco Systems,
story.
Which is an amazing story
Yes.
of a company in an extremely rapidly changing market with huge disruptors and disruptions out there. He vowed, on the basis of learning from the Wang experience, to never let that happen again. It's a way of saying that strategy and leadership, that combination, it's learned. And that's one of the way stations, so to speak, on our roadmap.
Yes.
Becoming self-conscious about taking both pieces and putting them together.
And he had some challenges even at Cisco. And when things kind of got rough, I think you call it an instructive experience in the book, because I think that's what you call it, right? He had that Wang experience. He said, whoa, wait a minute, I've seen this before.
Right.
I've experienced this before. So we use that lesson, and that comes under learn to lead strategically.
Yes,
right?
And I think also it's important to mention that this strategy you chose of growing via acquisition, lots of acquisitions, over 100, the percentage success rate of acquisitions is around a little under 40%.
Yeah.
And technology-based acquisitions, 30%. So this was, at some level, a risky strategy.
because he was an acquirer. He was a serious
Serious,
acquirer.
yes.
First 10 years, basically all he did.
That's all you did,
Right? And so that took a tremendous skill set to integrate those cultures
Exactly.
and all that activity, right?
And what he did was he built the integration capability ahead of the acquisitions. And this was his learning from Wang, that Wang never really sourced technology. They believed that we can do it in-house. And he promised himself that, then that was the instructional learning, that
Yeah.
if I have the situation again, I will learn how to source technology.
Yes.
So that's fascinating.
And that is so important. You've interviewed business people, from alumni, people that have been from Wharton School. But I don't know if you can learn that in a book. You know, I mean,
That's
you
right.
can learn that, but you know, it's you
Yeah.
need both. You know,
So, Marty, you raised a great question, because these ideas, they're out there, but it is amazing how somehow difficult they are to get a hold of in a behavioral sense. We can write them down. Here's the idea.
behavioral sense.
And you've got to take these ideas, cognitive ideas, and translate them into what you do. And for that, we advocate in the book, from our own experience and a lot of research to go with it, that if you want to become a strategic leader, you've got to become self-conscious about making yourself into a strategic leader by using 3 avenues. Just to quickly pull them apart. Number 1, instructive experience. You've already used that the phrase we use in the book. Life is a lifelong set of experiences,
Yes.
and if you have an experience that's instructive, in the U.S. Armed Forces, they always talk about the after-action review. There are many ways to look back, to look forward. But anyway, that's a key avenue of taking your tangible experience and learning from it. Number 2, picking up a book. I see it in front of us by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. It's called Execution, one of the great books of the era. Reading books, watching these days lots of commentary along this line on Facebook and YouTube and elsewhere. And number 3, sometimes forgotten because it just doesn't have the prominence we think it should have, finding people who will work with you in a close-in mentoring or coaching way.
One-on-one coaching. You referred to that in the book.
We do.
Yeah.
And the basic idea is you want somebody who's already been there, they've gone off a cliff or two themselves, they've had an experience, and they can say to you, as you're about to take a big step, maybe a strategic redirection or an acquisition, here are a few things, if you're really being a strategic leader, to watch out for, because they've seen it themselves.
Yes. Yes. We are speaking with Professor Singh and Professor Useem from the Wharton School. Their great book that we're talking about is The Strategic Leader's Roadmap, 6 Steps for Integrating Leadership and Strategy. In terms of other leading, let's give a little plug, if you will, for Knowledge at Wharton. That's a great source. I go there all the time. It's a great source in terms of podcast. You should watch the Business Builder Show or listen to the Business Builder Show. Of course, we should all subscribe to that.
That's a given.
That's a given. But the Knowledge at Wharton is great, and Wharton Digital Press, which you're featured on that site right now, the book. So that's great. So we're talking about all of this. So the one of the steps is to ensure strategic fit. Ensure strategic fit. And you use the example of GlaxoSmithKline. Can you remember that example? And I think that's a great example of ensuring strategic fit.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that and turn the baton over to Harbir in just a second. At GlaxoSmithKline, now about 6 years ago, as there was a executive succession event coming up, a CEO was going to step down. The company identified 2 internal candidates who looked really, really good.
Right.
And many big companies, of course, do that now. You want orderly succession,
Sure.
to say the obvious. But having said that, the board, the top people there also said, well, let's look around a bit more. And they came on a third person who was in his early 40s at the time, not an obvious candidate, to use American political language, kind of a dark horse.
Right.
But the key point that we draw upon in the book is GlaxoSmithKline brought in an outside agent, a person who spent time interviewing 14 people who had worked for the top 3 people, 2 obvious, 1 dark horse. And what this outside person discovered is that given where GlaxoSmithKline was going, it's a big pharma company, UK and US based, where it was going and the way the pharma world was changing, it needed a particular blend of strategic thinking. And then in talking to the 14 people who best knew these three candidates, it turned out the dark horse brought the best strategic fit for where the company was going. And that person, to the surprise of most people, probably including the person himself, was appointed chief executive.
But that's ensuring the strategic fit, getting the right person, the right team, and that kind of thought process. Anything to add to that?
Well, I think if you look at Daimler-Benz, you see a similar story. Less about selecting across, but more across periods of time. So they had Jürgen Stremp, who was a very celebrated leader.
Yes.
And, took Daimler, which was very diverse, and sold a lot of businesses and focused it. And then the press kept asking him, the analysts asked him, where's your answer for the mid-priced car and the U.S. presence? And he made the decision to buy Chrysler, which turned out to be a very unfortunate decision.
Yes.
Mostly because of cultural issues and also maybe not really understanding how to implement. So the strategy was there, but the implementation piece, which we stress in the book, was not fully articulated, and that became an error.
Yes.
Then they brought in Dieter Zetscher, who actually had spent 2 years in Chrysler. And he
knew the culture, was more familiar with it, understood.
Yes.
Correct?
And it was a global mindset, and he's actually now running Daimler, and they're doing many more partnerships and going more global in that way. So, linking the leader's attributes to the strategic needs is crucial.
Yeah,
and you see that in that case as well.
Absolutely. And the folks who are listening to this already, we have, thank goodness, a lot of people who watch and listen to the Business Builder Show. And most of our audience, I shouldn't say that. We have across the board, we have people from big international companies who listen and watch. But I want to make sure we drive home the point that this is not just for big companies.
Yes.
This is for everybody. So whatever size business you're at, this applies. And we're talking about 6 steps for putting the two of these together. So I want to drive home that point, how important that is. I loved the whole book. I really did. I read it twice, by the way. So.
Outstanding.
So this idea of conveying strategic intent, which I think is step number 4, conveying strategic intent. And you actually had a couple of stories in there about a mine disaster, an earthquake, and that was all about strategic intent. Who wants to talk to me about that?
I'll pick up on that, Marty. And we reference in Chile the fact that a president coming into office a couple of years ago, 10 days before he was to take office, before his inauguration, he's elected.
10 days before.
Yeah, boy. So
10 days before.
You've got to be ready.
Yeah.
Chile's hit with one of the greatest earthquakes of the 20th century. And it was almost as big as the earthquake that destroyed so much of Japan back in 2011 when the Fukushima reactor blew up and all that. Main point, though, is this. The president knew for recovering, for saving lives, coming back from this terrible, devastating event, 530 people were killed, that he really couldn't do a whole lot himself. But he could work through his cabinet, 20 plus people in his cabinet, director of infrastructure, there was a minister of mines. And so the president, on the premise, and it's such a good premise, that you need to clarify and communicate unequivocally what your intent is, and don't meddle, don't micromanage. Eyes on, but hands off is a phrase
I love that.
Often used.
Yeah.
He said to his ministers, here is what we're going to do, and I'm going to leave it to you to do it. Case in point, I'll end on this. He said to the Minister of Education, who just about had a cow when he heard the statement, the president said,
how are we going to do this?
Well, in fact, the reaction was, are you kidding? We can't do this.
He may have said different words, but we'll keep that clean.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
We won't try to translate those.
We won't do that, yes.
So he said to the Minister of Education, we're at the end of our summer, we got 1 million kids going back to school, and a third of them don't have schoolhouses. And I am asking you, I'm declaring to the country, to put the fire under your feet on this, that all school children in the entire country will be back in a school in 6 weeks. The minister said, privately, are you kidding?
Yeah.
But then, without further meddling or further micromanaging from the top, he did work out a way to do it. So school kids now are often in a classroom, in a church, in a home, in a school bus. But indeed, all 1 million school children were there. And so, let's see, here's the strategy. We've got people around us who can execute. And let's be clear on our intent and then let them get the job done.
Yes, so that was a clear leadership role. Past the strategy, everything was rolled into one, but the implementation. That leads me to the next one of the things that I think we have to spend some time on. We may not get to all the details because I definitely want to talk about some strategic leadership in action, but the idea of layering leadership, and I alluded to that earlier.
Yes.
Address that for us.
So if you look at the Nissan case that we talked about earlier, it was a gigantic operation. There were over 100,000 employees, problems that hadn't been solved for at least 15 years. And the idea was to declare the intent, which was the revival program. That speaks to what Mike was saying earlier.
Right.
But in that intent, there were 4 specific platforms: supply chain, factories, a number of platforms, and innovation. And those 4 platforms were then sort of articulated into 9 initiatives.
Right.
And these 9 initiatives had leaders that were handpicked from within the organization.
Looks like we're describing layers so far.
It's exactly. It's cascading into the organization. But then once it got, you can almost think about it hierarchically, but then it goes back vertically up, because these leaders were given a lot of room to innovate and actually redefine their agenda if they had to. So I think the point is that often people make the mistake of thinking that I have a strategy, I'm going to give it to this person or this team and they will execute. But what you need to do is articulate the mission, give a scope, but let people innovate within that. Mm-hmm. And then if you have different teams working on different things, they can be more coordinated, and that way you don't have chaos of everybody kind of trying to innovate and working at cross purposes. So this blend between what you might call, inducing a new set of decisions, and then at the same time people autonomously coming up with their own decisions, that blend of inducing and getting autonomous innovation, I think that combination is actually crucial.
At the very beginning, I said something to the effect that it's important that managers and leaders at just about all levels, I want to ask you the question, is it not critically important that all those layers that you just described are think strategically and lead strategically? It's just not the leaders at the top of the heap here, right?
Yes. So everybody owns strategy. That's what
everybody owns it.
Yes, it's not just the top management. Everybody owns it, but they need to have a sort of a scope and an agenda in which they operate, and that has to cascade in some way so we get some orderly action.
So that strategy, along with that inspiration or aspiration or vision, whatever, that has to be part of it. The people part of it has to be part. That's why the mergers and acquisitions often do fail, because that's what's missing.
Exactly.
Right? Anything to add? And then I'd like to get into something.
Just very briefly on that. Our thinking has radically evolved as we've been involved in this business for a while, from thinking of leadership as we do traditionally as something about the top people or the top team. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, in part because companies, large and small, are becoming so decentralized that we take the view, and we think it's totally correct, that you need to think about leadership and owning strategy, whether you're the chief executive officer or the head of human resources or finance, or a frontline man or woman who's got 4 or 5 employees.
Absolutely.
And in that regard, we take the view that it is incumbent upon everybody, I liked Harbir's phrase just a couple of seconds ago, to own strategy. Now it's going to be at their level. It's not the big competitive strategy. And to grab the problem that they're facing and solve it as a leader would solve it. So they've got to have their own vision. They've got to be persuasive in communicating. They've got to be a decisive decision maker.
And they just have a line of sight to that overall strategy. But in their particular division, their particular group, their particular team, they need to have these things that we're talking about, having that that strategy and that whole leadership into one package. It can't be either or, especially in today's world. So many things are changing. We could spend a half hour on that.
Exactly.
There's things going on. But let's get into something that I'd like to spend time on. I'm being selfish now. The whole idea of strategic leadership in action. I'd love to talk about PepsiCo.
Mm-hmm.
The work that they're doing is Indra Nooyi. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's talk about PepsiCo and strategic leadership in action.
So I think PepsiCo, the interesting thing about them is that carbonated soft drinks became a problem in recent times because of the view that people had that there was a lot of sugar and excess calories. And I think Indra Nooyi was able to sort of reformulate the strategy and talk about nutrition and think about the firm as a food company rather than just carbonated.
She sold some assets, did she not?
Sold some assets, did a lot of reformulation, and then each leader had their own agenda, their own charter to actually work towards that. And I think Mike has more detail on that as well.
Yeah, I think I would just add on that it's a wonderful illustration of the fact that historically, the way we tend to think of the world, we should have a strategy, then we should lead its execution. That's sort of the textbook view of how the world should work. But we know this, that as companies are formed or institutions are created in one era, in the next era, it just may not be the right direction to go in. So strategy, structure follows, strategy, leadership follows. But thinking about Indra Nooyi, CEO there at Pepsi, for reasons that Harbir outlined, her world was changing. People want nutritious drinks, and that's the way the world's going. So think about the causal arrow now flipping. Strategy should drive the kind of leadership. You want the right fit. But then as the market changes, the world changes, new technologies come along, new mindsets emerge. You want that leader to not be wedded to a outdated strategy.
It's no longer business as usual.
Right.
We a whole other thing. Yeah. Also, I don't know if this is her phrase or if this is how you describe it, but it's called performance with purpose.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I'm big into the triple bottom line theory. We have interviewed other, CEOs and this whole idea of triple bottom line, which is basically what she's looking at in terms of the performance with purpose. I love that approach.
It is exactly. I think many CEOs might put pressure on the company for quarterly earnings and may talk about these other things, but people will squeeze towards quarterly earnings. I think by giving performance with purpose, she ensured that people had both agendas at every level. There's one more example of leadership in action, which is Alibaba and Jack Ma.
Oh, absolutely.
And
sure.
What's fascinating about that is that Jack Ma, actually, his background was that he's an English teacher.
Yes.
He learned English, did not really know how to program. But then he became the biggest innovator on online retail.
Yes.
And one of the things he talked about in his, created in his company was the idea that everybody has to adopt the new direction of the market and think about how the company needs to evolve to that. So astonishingly, eBay was already doing well in China when Alibaba started, and eBay had a great partner with proper execution. Normally that should work very well. But one thing they missed was the Chinese consumers' interest in negotiation.
Wow.
And so Jack Ma actually required his programmers to build in a sort of a way for people to negotiate with the seller.
That's something.
And that was not happening anywhere else in the world. So I think the interesting thing is strategy has to be original in some way and having the courage to be different. But then getting the company to move in that direction, that combination is really the combination of good strategy and leading people to a different place.
And I also think of looking into the future. I'm friends with Daniel Burris, and he's a futurist, and he's come up with some wonderful, wonderful thought processes. So this is a tough job, though, doing all this work. So we need to kind of wrap up. We could probably come up with Wells Fargo was an easy one. I teed that up for you easily, Mikey. That was an easy one. Can we think of someone to kind of wrap up a positive, a leader or a company that's a role model of what you're talking about here in terms of integrating strategy and leadership? Anyone you can think of you'd like to talk about?
Why don't you go first, Maggie? Yeah.
I think what I would reference here by way of picking up on that is an amazing person. We spent time with him who had been a business leader. He had built, this is again back to Chile, had built Chile's biggest retail chain. Anybody buying cornflakes in Chile will know this chain. Mm-hmm. Kind of a cross between Target and Walmart and a more grocery kind of setup. He was asked to come into the administration of Chile by, again, a person who had come out of business, had become president, as the Minister of Mines. And this particular individual, his name is Lawrence Goldborn, received a message that there were 33 miners trapped half a mile below the desert in northern Chile in a copper mine. And he sprung into action, having no background in mining engineering, but knowing what the vision was here, the purpose, to bring 33 miners back to the surface. Mm-hmm. He literally learned the engineering required. Leadership is always learning, with a unequivocal intent coming from the president. We want those miners to come back to the surface. And in the next 4 months, he, through a series of extraordinary leadership moments, did create got the shafts down, finally brought the miners up. And my guess is half your viewers here probably saw at least one of those miners come to the surface. Mm-hmm. It's estimated that 1 billion people watched at least one of the 33 miners reach the surface. And they are alive today because of the strategy and the leadership of the president, number one, of the Minister of Mines, number two, who was out there day to day, and by the way, number three, the shift supervisor who was with the other 32. He worked to keep everybody alive when they're half a mile below so that they could be rescued. So just maybe as a way of summary, we want layered leadership.
Yes.
3 different physical layers. Capital on the site and half a mile down. We want everybody to be completely clear on what the intent is, or the ultimate mission is. Then we need a strategy to make that happen. And even if it's unfamiliar territory, maybe a new technology has come along, or you've got a tough new competitor, to not be shy about solving the problems. And for us, it's kind of almost like the A case. The strategy and leadership make a difference. If well put together, the answer is yes.
Absolutely. Some good news. Share a story with us, kind of wrap us up a little bit.
I think, because this is a wonderful example from Chile, I think in the corporate world, I'll give you 2 brief ones. One is just briefly talking about Jack Ma a little bit more. So Alibaba was the largest IPO in history coming out of China. And after it happened, people said, oh, of course, why would it not be the case? But if you asked yourself, would a online retail company from China open its stock offering in the US, you would say, I'm not so sure, because, who knows what the payment habits are in China, logistics and so on. And it was really the agility of Alibaba, and this is sort of the combination of strategy and leadership, that they were able to remake the company several times over in just about 10 years.
Great case study.
Another example is Infosys from India, which was started by a computer scientist who in the 80s, when he saw that there was demand for software programmers, and again in the late 90s for Y2K, they brought in a lot of programmers to the US for fixing the problem of 2001. But then he made the goal in his company that we don't want to just send software programmers overseas. We want to compete with our products. Mm-hmm. And so his famous goal was, we want respect in the global marketplace. Mm. And he actually hired some very, very good engineers and began competing with the likes of Accenture and others. Mm-hmm. And actually, they eventually arrived at that level. So I think the idea of leadership is high aspiration, but also then execution towards that, and then layering the leadership to actually get there. So both examples, I think.
We could go on for a long time. I know we didn't get to the corporate board, which is a very important part of it, but we're kind of out of time. You need to read this book, The Strategic Leader's Roadmap. And again, the last part of it is dealing with the boards and how important that is, and the whole that is critically important in this whole work. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of the Business Builder Show. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
Thank
Marty.
you.
It's been great. You have been listening to the Business Builder Show. Actually, you have been watching the Business Builder Show. I am your host, Marty Wolf. Thank you so much for being part of what we do here, and enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks again to Kevin's Worldwide, one of America's leading promotional products and uniform companies, for supporting this edition of the Business Builder Show.
Bringing the business classroom to you. It's the Business Builder Show with Marty Wolf.